This is Josh Marshall from Talking Points Memo, TPM Media. My colleague, David Kurtz, who is the editor of TPM's Morning Memo. And we have an event coming up on the 29th event in Washington, D.C. On the 29th to dig into the topic that we are about to have a brief conversation about. And that topic is the politicization and corruption of the Department of Justice under the second presidency of Donald Trump. And as you know, there are so many things going on in this administration. So many different channels of corruption and betrayals of public trust and so forth. But one of the things that we learned from what we usually like to think of as other societies, they talk about in the Soviet Union and now Russia, they often talk about the power ministries, and that is usually internal security, defense, and in different countries, secret police. But these are the departments, the federal agencies that control the legitimate use of violence. And in the United States, that is the Pentagon, it is the Department of Justice, it is the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Justice is at the center of that. So corruption of the Department of Justice isn't just someone getting a freebie or a nice, a fat contract that they weren't entitled to or something like that. It can mean you being put in jail or having ICE show up at your doorstep and roust you, or get in what seems like a minor momentary disagreement with some ICE agents, and a few moments later you're dead. So let's dig right in, because what David and I wanted to talk about today is right after the shooting in Minneapolis. I guess it's 10 days ago now. The FBI announced that they were taking sole authority over the investigation of that shooting. A lot has happened since then. David, bring us up to date. And let's start from the beginning. That happens normally.
Yeah, that happens on January 7th, and you would expect in any sort of law enforcement related shooting like that the FBI, especially if it's not an FBI agent, that you would have the FBI come in and take a look at it. And initially they did, and we learned from the Washington Post yesterday that the agent concluded that there was grounds to proceed with civil rights investigation into whether it was a good shooting or not. So far, so good. But around the same time that was happening, the U.S. Attorney in Minnesota reportedly, and we're not sure at whose direction he was operating, decided that they were no longer going to cooperate with state authorities and conduct a joint investigation of the shooting, which would not be uncommon to do a joint investigation of that kind. And the reporting is that the FBI was fine with that, but prosecutors, the Justice Department writ large, was not. And so they got squeezed out. So that left just the Justice Department investigation. And for all the reasons that you were just enunciating a moment ago, there was every reason in the world to be suspicious of how credible and thorough and proper an investigation would be conducted by a Justice Department that is controlled and directed out of the Trump White House, which is really what we're talking about. When we talk about politicization, weaponization, a year ago, we might have talked about it in slightly different terms, but given where we are now and how fast things have moved, what it really means is that it's being directed out of the White House. And what we know about Donald Trump and his short attention span and his lack of attention to detail and all the rest is that there are key underlings who are conducting the department oversight there, whether it's Stephen Miller or others who we don't know or can't pinpoint. That's what it really means, right? So there's no longer any independence between the White House and the Justice Department. And it's been made abundantly clear that what the White House says is what goes. And you've got Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, you've got Kash Patel, the FBI Director, who've gone to great lengths to make it clear that they're eager to abide by and cozy up to and curry favor with the White House. And so there's not even a pretense of independence. So with that as context, suddenly you're just left with the DOJ investigation, but quickly that just ended. It just flat out ended. And what happened apparently was that the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ, which would typically look at this type of incident, was run by Harmeet Dillon, who is a a Trump toady going back to the 2020 election, and immediately decided that there was no space for a civil rights investigation to be conducted here, that wasn't going to happen. And that resulted in the resignation of a half a dozen attorneys within the Civil Rights Division in DC. They're just like, okay, we're done. Whatever's happened up to now has been bad enough, but this crosses a line that we can no longer abide. And so that, I don't think we knew that about a week and a half ago, but I'm not sure that we fully understood yet that meant there was going to be no federal investigation of this, that without the Civil Rights Division looking, it just wasn't going to happen.
And normally speaking, when the Justice Department, the FBI, obviously is an independent agency, kind of under the Justice Department, that all they are really going to do is do a civil rights investigation. That's the only kind of investigation you're going to do of this kind of incident, right? So if you're not doing that, you're not doing anything.
That's right. I think there was, and this may have been my own lack of full understanding, is I had a sense that the FBI was still looking into it. Well, what that was going to manifest as, how that was going to look once they conferred with DOJ wasn't yet clear. But now it seems pretty clear that FBI was willing to go forward with some type of investigation. DOJ shut it down. And yeah, without the civil rights angle, there's not a whole lot left. I mean, it gets a little worse than that even. If I can jump ahead, we learned also yesterday, later in the day, that apparently there was an effort. I mean, most of our listeners have probably heard that DOJ wanted to take a look into the political activities of Good and her widow and see if there was anything that they could prosecute there. So it's not just not looking into whether this was a good shooting or not,
right,
or proper shooting, but whether there was, culpability on the part of the victim. It's
right.
Basically the real issue is looking into the political activities, right? The First Amendment protected activities. And apparently the FBI did get a warrant to search Good's car, but it was never used. And they went back to get a warrant to investigate her for assault. And a magistrate judge was like, no, you can't prosecute a deceased person, so I'm not going to give you a warrant. But it calls into question, again, what's the order of priorities here, right? And it's clearly not holding ICE to account. And I want to be clear, like these kind of shootings, the legal history on these is pretty law enforcement friendly. And so I think under any administration, it would be, even with all the video, which was pretty stark and pretty dramatic, I don't think it's a guarantee that you would end up with a prosecution or conviction here. But we're not even getting to the point of doing an investigation into what happened, right? So just to give you some sense of how off kilter this all is.
Now, let me ask you this, because one of the things I think we've seen in the last almost year of this Trump administration is that the Department of Justice, there are courts, you have rights and all these kind of things, but those rights come into play when you are on trial, when you are actually maybe going to have your liberty taken away from you. That's when you can contest certain rights before the judiciary, claim various constitutional rights and so forth. But until you get to that, there's all sorts of things that the Department of Justice can do pretty much with no review whatsoever. They can just decide not to investigate something, which obviously has tremendous consequences. But you can't, David is, for our listeners, David is a lawyer, hasn't been practicing in a while, but there's no one's going to come in and you can get standing to force the Department of Justice to investigate something. And we saw this with Governor Walz and Mayor Fry, I think is how his name's pronounced,
yeah,
to start a federal investigation of them for conspiracy to obstruct ICE and so forth. And that's kind of the same thing. They just make a finding and you're off to the races, and you're not going to end up behind bars because of investigation, but you can get subpoenaed and have raids and lots of stuff. So I want to get to this issue of when they froze out, because when the first news of this broke right after the shooting, the first kind of post news of the shooting, that we heard that the FBI had asserted sole jurisdiction over this, that the local authorities, state attorney general, the municipal authorities in Minneapolis had no rights to that. And the way those news stories ran sort of seemed like that's something the feds can do. Just say, okay, we have jurisdiction here. You can't. But that's not really how this works. This was more kind of like possession is 9/10 of the law they were there, they had the evidence, and they're not going to share it. So
that's right. That's right. And I think there's two things to take from that. One is just to show how serious and drastic a measure they were taking, right? That they were going to cut out the state authorities. I mean, a lot of these civil rights cases in the past, I mean, everything's turned around here. Everything's upside down. I think we know the history is state and local authorities aren't as aggressive, typically, historically, on civil rights as they should be. And the federal government acts as a backstop to that, right? You remember back as far back, it's like the Rodney King case, right? That there were state charges, and when those were insufficient, then the feds came in with a subsequent prosecution. That's what this typically looks like. So the cooperation at the front end is good practice. It reflects sort of a equanimity between the parties, understanding there's dual jurisdictions and that kind of thing. But it also represents like a historical understanding that the Justice Department has a real stake under federal civil rights law dating back to the Civil War in these kinds of cases. So them doing that in the first place was a big deal just for those reasons. Secondarily, but also important, is that without that level of cooperation, it makes it very difficult for the state to pursue an independent case if they don't have access to the evidence. A lot of people have reacted pretty vehemently. They should do it anyway. They should proceed kind of regardless of that. And that may be, but it just makes it a lot harder to do, right? So it's not so much whether you have the will, it's do you have the way,
right,
without access to the crime scene, without access to the evidence, without access to witnesses in the same way that you would have if you were doing a joint investigation.
Now, isn't some of this in this case because ICE is there, that the feds are there kind of in force. Federal agents are the primary witnesses and the shooter. So in some sense, the FBI and the federal government had a unique ability. They kind of had a lot of the evidence where they might not in a normal case where the local police show up. So there is, and
That's right.
that I think is the point that I wanted people to understand, that they were appearing to assert a right that doesn't exist. The FBI can't come in and tell local police authorities or local prosecutors to stand down. And this is this key issue that we at TPM have been talking a lot about, that the state and local state authorities are subordinate authorities, subordinate sovereignties under the federal constitution, that they have sovereign authority and they are separate from the federal government. So we can see here, I mean, people saw this, and I think a lot of them rightly said, okay, well, this is the cover-up, right? They're not going to let the locals investigate this. But there's also this big assertion of non-existent authority where the federal government is kind of coming in and...
Yeah, I might phrase it differently. I think there's joint jurisdiction here, right? And each have authority under their own jurisdictional statutory, kind of constructs to proceed here. And there's a lot, there's always a little bit of tension in these kind of situations, right? Between local and federal law enforcement. And one of the advantages the FBI in particular often has is just better resources, crime lab, like all of the things that you would want and need to do a top flight investigation typically reside on their side of the equation and not necessarily on the state side. So I think both things are true, but it just doesn't usually work this way. And there's not, even when there is this kind of tension, it's not usually generated by a desire that goes all the way up to the highest levels of the federal government, including the White House, to try to keep any bad news or bad outcomes or embarrassing facts from coming out, right? And I think that's what makes this so distinct from all the other cases that we've seen in this arena, right? In the police shooting arena.
And as far as we know right now, no authority is investigating this shooting with access to all the evidence.
That's right. I want to qualify that a little bit. After they were squeezed out initially, Minnesota went ahead and said, we're going to launch our own investigation anyway.
Right.
And as far as I know, that is still proceeding. I am curious, I mentioned this in today's morning memo, if there's not an active federal investigation, which is what Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche said Sunday on national TV, then I don't know what basis there would be for them not providing the evidence that Minnesota would be entitled to investigate itself. I think what you may end up running into pretty quickly are some of the supremacy clause issues that you mentioned, some of the qualified immunity issues that the federal agent would have here that could quickly become areas of contention. But at the moment, we don't know what Minnesota has had access to. We don't know if the FBI is continuing to squeeze them out from access to everything. We don't know that they have it. I will say that. And I don't know what basis there would exist for not giving them that now, that there is no, there basically, we don't want you messing with our investigation would be, or getting in conflict with us. It's going to somehow spoil evidence or make our job prosecuting this is harder, is what the feds would typically say.
Right.
The locals might grumble and gripe, but they would typically go along with this. It's just, we're so like upside down right now that it's just a different dynamic.
And to be clear, just to sort of tease out the different things here, the qualified immunity issue is not an issue of jurisdiction per se. They can investigate it. It's just that at trial, a federal agent has a fairly robust defense.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's true of the supremacy clause issues as well. Like, I don't think that would keep them from investigating. It may prevent, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I could see it might be problematic in terms of interviewing agents who were there, that even people not the shooter, that kind of thing. But again, I don't think I don't think that typically would be enough to sort of freeze everything in its tracks without even being able to look into it.
Right. Okay. So what we're talking about here is the broader issue of, the fact that we have just seen it now for really kind of since last January, but certainly accelerating in recent months, that the Department of Justice is almost like a private investigators firm for Donald Trump in the White House, in the way that, I think we know that a lot of very wealthy people have private investigators sort of on retainer. And when people get in their grill, you have stuff coming down on you. And that's kind of, in a way, that really is the model here.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's two. It's a shield for his allies and people who he wants to give protection to, whether they're allies or not, for some transactional reason. And it's a sword against his foes and anyone he wants to treat as other, or, whether that's entire groups of people based on their color or ethnicity or affiliations, or whether it's people that he feels have wronged him personally. So you get this, it's the old, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. And the Justice Department is the point of that spear right now.
So, all right. So we have an event. TPM has an event. Morning Memo has an event on the 29th of this month, where that is going to be all about this critical issue, which is, again, politicization and corruption of the Department of Justice going back to January 2025. Now, we've got you're running the event. It's a panel. You've got a number of experts on, exiles from the DOJ. So tell us who is going to be at that event and what you guys are going to dig into.
Yeah, so I'll be moderating, and I've got three panelists. Aaron Zielinski, who was a member of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team back in the first term and was the lead prosecutor on Roger Stone. And I think that will help give us some historic perspective that some of what we're seeing now had already started to happen back then, but it was less stark, in some instances less clear. The Stone case was pretty stark, so that'll be an interesting perspective to bring. We've got Stacey Young, who's a former DOJer, who founded an organization called Justice Connection, which helps provide support for people that are still working in the department and for people who have been laid off, terminated, or have resigned. Partly networking, partly legal support and resources and that kind of thing. So she's got a really good perspective on everything that's happened in this past year. And then Anna Bauer, reporter from Lawfare, who's a great journalist on these subjects and has been covering all this very closely too. And has sort of gotten swept up in it on occasion herself. She was the reporter that Lindsay Halligan, the wannabe interim U.S. attorney in Eastern District of Virginia, was doing signal chats with after the Comey and James indictment. So a lot of really smart, knowledgeable people with direct experience in the arena. So I'm looking forward to talking with all of them.
And that is in Washington, D.C. It's
next Thursday on the 29th. And all the details are in Morning Memo each day, and you can link through for tickets and further details on where.
Yeah, you can go to Morning Memo, and you can also just go to the Talking Points Memo main website, talkingpointsmemo.com. We'll have a link in the editor's blog if you want to join us on the 29th.
And I just see that Allegra put up a link for tickets in the live chat panel on this feed.
Right down there at the bottom. Cool. Yep. Cool. All right. This is fun. We'll do more of these for everybody. Yeah, listen in. Thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you again soon.